Hello and welcome everybody. I'm just giving people time to still join, settle in. So in a couple of minutes, I'll introduce and get this webinar off and running. In the meantime, just please be aware that you can make use of the chat function to communicate with us, to ask any questions. And please note that any questions that you may have, we will get to and answer at the end of the webinar and the presentation. But we will be reading them, and if we don't get a chance to answer them, we'll be able to contact you. We'll send out an email answering any questions that you may have. But I'm going to give a couple more minutes for people to join. Until then, sit tight. Okay, I'm going to start with a brief introduction. My name is Nick Hardwick. I am the research associate at DFI, or Digital Frontiers Institute. And if you haven't joined one of our webinars before, welcome. Really excited to have you guys here. If this is one that if you've been a part of one before, then you know how this goes. I'm going to introduce myself, a bit about our presentation and our panelists. And then if you've got any questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So in terms of what I do at DFI, I help collaborate with partners and other industry professionals. And part of my role is disseminating research and information in the digital financial services to listeners like you, to anybody out there who has a hunger to find out more, and also to give people a platform to disseminate their research and what they've been doing in their work. And we've done a number of these with FIDA and Carabao, so I thought I would just introduce Carabao. They are strategy and research and delivery consultancy dedicated to building ethical, sustainable, and digital economies. Carabao hosts the MasterCard Foundation's Partnership for Finance in a Digital Africa, also known as FIDA. If you've joined one of our previous webinars, you would have seen FIDA and the logos as part of your registration. FIDA is the learning partner to MasterCard's next generation financial services program, and they bring together knowledge and insights to promote meaningful financial inclusion in a world which is increasingly digital. And this is why we at DFI are very keen and very interested to hear what the team have been doing, because it is very much part of our agenda. And I'm sure it's part of yours too, if you're joining into this call. And in order to do this, FIDA works directly with the MasterCard Foundation's direct partners, as well as financial institutions, mobile operators, fintechs, and others across the digital finance space. And after that, FIDA aggregates and synthesizes the knowledge, conducts research to address key gaps, and identify implications for the diverse actors working in the space. Ultimately, the goal is to inform decisions with facts. And that's part of, I'm sure, a lot of our roles in DFS, as well as accelerating meaningful financial inclusion for people across sub-Saharan Africa. Now, when it comes to the facts, evidence of impact on low-income clients is at the top of the lists in terms of importance. There's really currently a lot of excitement around the potential of digital financial services to improve lives. However, the evidence is surprisingly thin. And in order to address that, FIDA have developed the evidence gap map to create a knowledge base and roadmap for those working in digital finance and who care about impact. And to get into the details, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Niamh Barry, the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Lead for the Feeder Partnership. So I'm going to hand over to her now. And just a final piece of housekeeping. Remember, if you've got any questions, just drop them in the chat function and we'll address them once the presentation is over. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nick, and also Digital Frontiers Institute for hosting this webinar. So I'm pretty delighted to be able to speak to you today about the updated version of the Digital Finance Evidence Gap Map, or EGM. So the FIDA partnership's work on the impact question really began about 2 years ago, when together with the MasterCard Foundation, we were seeking to understand a bit more about the impact of digital finance on low-income clients in particular. And so to answer this, we decided to create a map of the evidence so that we could more clearly see the landscape that we were working with. And so this kind of incidentally led to the creation of the Digital Finance Evidence Gap Map. And the first version was launched in November 2017. And version 2 was launched just a few weeks ago at the IFC Knowledge event in Dar es Salaam. So in this webinar, I'd like to do 4 things if possible. The first is to tell you about the updated evidence gap map and give you a demonstration of the tool. The second is to speak to you about how we as the digital finance community often talk about impact and what kind of caveats we need to be aware of when we review findings from impact studies. And the third is really to put a magnifying glass on a few digital finance products and share some examples of the type of insights that you can gather from an analysis of the evidence gap map. And finally, I want to, sorry, I'm saying that there's a bit of quietness on my side. Second. Is that better? Perfect, I think so. Perfect, sorry. And finally, I want to wrap up and give some thoughts about what the digital finance community could do to learn more about the impact of DFS on clients, and hopefully have some time for questions as well. All right, so let's get into this. So the EGM charts the landscape of impact evidence, be it positive, negative, or null, for a set of digital finance products plotted against a set of client outcomes. So in version 2 of the evidence gap map, we have a total of 55 studies on 60 different products, and together they did close to 190 tests on various client outcomes. So let's have a closer look. So hopefully you're seeing this all okay. This is the evidence gap map as it is, and we have 2 views of it. The first view that we're looking at right now is the study map. And here you can see the set of digital finance product categories down here on the columns, the rows, and in the columns you have a set of clients' outcomes. And so the gray bubble indicates if there has been a particular study on that particular product and that particular outcome. So right here with the number 3, we can see that there's been 3 studies on P2P that have looked at improving clients' savings behavior. And so if you want to learn more, you just click on the little bubble and you can find out more about the particular studies, their names, what DFS they tested, what design and delivery mechanisms they used, and whether it has comparison groups. And you can, of course, link to all those studies as well. The other thing we've done is create a number of filters for those who want a little bit more of a nuanced analysis. For example, you can filter by all the particular digital finance products. So you can see those across there if you're interested in only one in particular. If you're interested in a particular design and delivery mechanism, we have, about 28 of these coded at the moment. So if you're only interested in two-way SMS, you can just view all the studies so far that have tested a digital finance product that use two-way SMS. Particular outcomes, you can also filter by those. Comparison groups, this is just a kind of a quick binary to check if that study used comparison groups or, it didn't, as a kind of robustness test. We also have looked at differential effects, and this is a new addition this year. We've kind of coded studies to whether they have highlighted any differential effects based on somebody's, gender, their income level, their education, or, their rural or urban location. So that's been pretty useful to us if we're trying to dig a little bit deeper as well. And you can, of course, filter by the design that the study used. For example, if you're only interested in RCTs, you can look at all the studies that did those. And if you're looking at trying to look at a snapshot of a particular country, you can see, what we know by a particular country. So it gets surprisingly sparse once we kind of start to drill down to these particular levels. And of course, publication year. So while we were reading these studies anyway, we decided we might as well also create a results map. And here you can see, a lot more color and, a lot more numbers. And the reason for, the more population here is because obviously studies don't tend to just test one thing, they test way more than one thing. So there's a lot more numbers here. And the colors, as you might imagine, green indicates a positive result on a particular product and a particular outcome. Red indicates a negative result, so a regression. And amber or orange indicates no effect. And again, you have exactly the same filters that you can use. And if you want to learn more, you can click on these and you can see, for example, on P2P and saving behaviors, you can see that this is 3 evidence points from 2 studies. So the number of evidence points does not always equal the studies if they've tested a few different things or they've tested the same outcome, but, by gender or, by education level. So that's pretty much the quick and the dirty of the evidence gap map. And the purpose of this is to really show us where we have insights and where we don't, and to put these insights in dialogue with each other so that we really avoid the many problems that can arise if we base our decisions on one prominent study, for example. But rather we're kind of encouraging an environment where we look at all the studies on a particular product. Just to go back to the presentation now. So we really see so many different use cases for the evidence gap map in terms of providers, the funders, investors, and researchers. For example, with digital finance product developers or practitioners, they could use the evidence gap map to search for evidence of what is shown to have client impact, which could inform their current or future products. Or they could kind of derive insights on which design and delivery mechanisms have or have not improved the uptake of a given product. And there's a lot of information on that that's pretty insightful. And also use evidence to fundraise for new approaches as well, or to scale existing products in areas where there's a little bit more ample evidence. With investors, we're looking at kind of ways in which they can make more evidence-based strategic investments in areas where there might be more high confidence evidence. Donors could use this to identify and support really the development of knowledge, particularly in areas that have not been explored. And so funding those particular programs or research where we have limited evidence. And of course, for those researchers interested in digital finance, there's a lot of things you can do in terms of, doing your own evidence synthesis based on the data points here, and also review gaps in evidence and hopefully, find collaborations and make investments to advance our impact knowledge. So before we look at some additional impact insights that we will be looking at a little bit later, I want to speak about a few important things we learned through the process of building the evidence gap map and devoting a lot of time to the impact question in the digital finance space. So we call these caveats to understanding or deriving meaning from impact study. And there's at least 5 things we need to think about when we talk about the impact of digital finance. So the first is really that digital finance is not one thing, right? It's numerous products. And to date, we have, digital banking, savings, credit, insurance, and several types of payments and transfers. And who knows what the future might bring. So as you've probably seen, the EGM has 14 digital finance product categories alone. But what we see is that payments and transfers account for 52% of the impact literature. Then it's savings and credit, and then insurance, which is just 12 studies, 7 studies, and 1 study. So the results from a P2P study is not going to help us figure out the impact of digital credit. So we really need to look at the gaps in what we know about certain products and work to correct that. The second is that we need to recognize that digital products can be designed and delivered in so many different ways. And that's the great thing about digital, right? It's the opportunity to enhance services and hopefully outcomes by layering additional elements on top. And we see a lot of this. As I showed, we have coded 28 design and delivery features from the 60 products that we have in the digital finance evidence gap map. If we just look at, for example, the 12 saving products that we have in the EGM, all in, we see 15 types of design and delivery mechanisms that were used to promote savings and enhance client outcomes. But if, for example, we look at 2 particular products, let's say the M-Pasanda in Afghanistan, here we have an employee saving product, which was piloted in Afghanistan, and it made savings default for all employees. And the employer had a matching incentive on varying percentages to encourage more saving among their employers. And then if you try and compare that with one of the Empower products, where it's obviously a mobile money saving device in Tanzania, it's open to the market at whole, and they used a mobile learning platform. They provided SMS reminders to save, and they provided training to female micro entrepreneurs in particular on both Empower and business skills. So all of this is to say is that when products are designed differently, even when they're both savings products, they may have different results and are not always generalizable. The third point is that markets vary. We could test a similar product in 2 countries and come up with different results. So far we just have 24 countries in the evidence gap map, and Kenya accounts for over a quarter of these studies, so 27%. And if you look at the East African region as a whole, they account for 52% of all the impact literature. And that's okay, because, there's a lot of innovation happening in that region that, needs to be tested. But what it is that it's an acknowledgement that we simply know less about other regions and other countries, and that much of our learning is coming from a particular region. So when we think about applying learnings from Tanzania to another country, we really need to think about the social, the economic, or the cultural or regulatory differences when we do so. The fourth point is that clients vary. We could test the same product in the same country, but with different client segments. For example, farmers or non-farmers, men and women, rural and urban. And we could come up with different results. And a few studies have highlighted this, that, some people benefit more, some people benefit less, and sometimes it's the same. But we only know this when we test for it. And to be honest, we rarely do. Just 23% of the studies in the evidence gap map looked for and highlighted that there were differential effects based on somebody's gender, location, income, or education. And my final point is that every study is not testing the same thing. It sounds obvious, but we see a lot of variation in the number of tests per these different outcomes, and choosing what to test for these various products is important. And, we're still in the early days, and we will, I think, refine these choices through kind of continued testing and learning and kind of developing smarter or more robust theories of change per each of these products. So digital finance is not one thing. The design and delivery varies, markets varies, clients varies, and studies test different things. And it's really important to keep these factors in mind when we're looking to both, develop products, target products, test their effects, and when we want to review insights from individual impact studies or, an aggregate analysis of the EGM studies. So with that background, let's have a quick look at a few insights that can be gleaned from an analysis of the studies in the evidence gap map. Now, these are going to be just highlights because, as I mentioned, there was close to 190 tests. So that's a lot of information to share, and it would make a very boring webinar. And also it's far beyond my brain capacity to remember the details of all of these. But we will be having a mini series on our blog that's currently in the pipeline, and that will be sharing kind of these insights in a lot more detail. And we're going to be starting with digital savings next week. So if you sign up to our newsletter or follow our LinkedIn or Twitter handle, then you have a good chance of being updated. So in terms of insights, the first thing we can look at is the big picture of results. And so while the number of studies currently available is small, 55 studies on 60 products, considering the growth and diversity of digital finance, we observe, all positive, negative, and null effects across the various digital finance products on, various different client outcomes. So overall, 65% of the reported tests were positive, 9% were negative, 26 were null. But the proportion really, really varies depending on what product was examined, which, we will go into. And I think it's really important to say that this doesn't mean that digital finance products work 65% of the time. And these are really diverse products, as I hope has been kind of highlighted with the savings examples. But if we want to look a little deeper, for example, we looked overall at what each of these studies were saying. And across the 60 products examined, we found that 55% reported exclusively positive results. 7% reported exclusively null results. 38% reported a mixed. And 0%, not surprisingly, reported exclusively negative results. So I think the takeaway here is really that we're at the beginning of our journey towards understanding the impact of digital finance products. And researchers are and should be casting their nets wide and testing a broad range of outcomes to interrogate various theories of change around impact of different products. And again, it's important to remember that we're just 10 years into this. So looking at the product level, as you've seen, the evidence gap map has found just 12 studies on digital savings that span 9 countries. And it's very early days in terms of the quantity of insights. The first savings study came out in 2011, and by 2015, there was only 4 more studies. And most studies really came and are coming from 2016 onwards. And so we should be pretty cautious about drawing conclusions or rendering verdicts kind of based on the study of 12 diverse products. You know, with the exception of two studies on, Tanzanian studies on Empower, you know, as I've said, the markets are different, the clients are different, the design and delivery mechanisms are different. But while we're far from, you know, any kind of conclusion, those of us who are interested in digital savings in particular could certainly take away some emerging insights from the studies, which we're going to be going into length at next week on our mini series. For example, you know, we've learned how interactive learning and nudges with behavioral science or two-way SMS or mobile learning has been really shown to enable at least better savings behaviors. And that's coming from 3 studies. Or an interesting insight for me was how when saving products are coupled with a client training, be it analog training or digitally enhanced training, it really appears to improve the longer term outcomes in terms of clients then optimizing the use of savings than, for example, providing just the savings product without training. So it's a lot more uncertain when training is not provided. And it was also really interesting to observe the positive effects of variations in types of savings account. For example, we have studies on default saving accounts, commitment saving accounts, and lock saving accounts. And there's also, you know, some cautionary insights on the less rosy impact of what can happen when you change an analog saving service to a digital saving service, or there's some insights on how client segments may interact differently to digital saving services. I think overall we could remain encouraged by the insights gathered on savings so far, and we certainly need to look for more opportunities to contribute to building the evidence on digital savings. You know, as you can see, there's clearly gaps in outcomes, there's gaps in the products, and certainly the markets as well. So when it comes to credit, we've located just 7 studies which have tested the effect of credit, which span 5 countries. Overall, the insights are limited, particularly for longer term welfare outcomes. And I think clearly the studies are not yet representative of the diversity of digital credit products that are currently available in the market. So again, we need to be cautious about making statements of impact when it comes to digital credit. But again, insights are surfacing, particularly on healthy borrowing amongst clients. So for example, there are some promising results in how both the framing and the timing of SMS reminders can improve repayment rates. Although differential effects were observed between men and women, and so we need a little bit more testing there. There's also insights on how making terms and conditions more salient and accessible may lead to better borrowing and repayment behavior. And also how interactive learning content on financial literacy has shown some promising results for repayment behaviors. So I think we know that like improving borrowers' behavior is not only good for clients, but good for business. But beyond borrowing behavior, we know very little. So in 2016, the Digital Credit Observatory noted that, to their knowledge, not a single quantitative impact evaluation has rigorously measured the social and economic impacts of digital credit. And that's a gap that they are now currently working on with a number of digital credit practitioners. So we should be really looking forward to that pipeline of work. Payments and transfers, I could do an entire session exclusively on this. It's, as you've seen, the most frequently evaluated digital finance product and accounts for over half of all the products in the evidence gap map, which is not surprising as it was the first mover, and some of these studies are now 10 years old. So we've located 31 studies which have examined the effects of 32 various digital payment and transfer products in 15 countries. Now, 9 of these studies were conducted in Kenya, with M-Pesa being the focus of 6 of these. And, you know, just to make sure we're aware of what payments and transfer products are available. You know, we have P2P, which is definitely the most evaluated payment and transfer product, but we also have business to person, government to person, bill payments, merchant payments, and so on. But predominantly a lot of our learning is really coming from P2P. And also, not really surprisingly, the mobile money channel is pretty dominant in this, except for kind of typically with G2P, which have used a little bit more of a variety of technologies to deliver payments. So there's a lot of insights, and again, which we'll be writing about, that can be extracted from the studies, particularly on P2P. You know, for example, I think the most popular hypothesis on the effects of P2P is that digital presents a quick and convenient channel to receive monies in times of, you know, a financial shock. You know, and 6 out of the 7 P2P studies that tested this, sorry. Oh, I've just gone way off loop there. Oh, my bad. I'll just stick there for some reason. It's causing me problems. Yeah, so 6 out of the 7 studies that tested this hypothesis found a positive effect on P2P, on client resilience. And I think perhaps one of the most interesting studies to date is one where we looked at both sides of the equation. And a study on bKash released this year in Bangladesh looked at both migrants who send money back home and their families. And it followed both of these in a dual side experiment using client surveys and transaction data. And this has never actually been done before. And they found, you know, clear evidence of migrants sending more money back home, and when a shock hit their family, less if they themselves were hit by a financial shock. And they saw their family's education outcomes improve, their health outcomes improved. And they also found that migrants who used bKash were less likely to be below the poverty line. But they did also find that the migrants who were sending money home have more difficulties at work, emotional problems, and poor health, which is, you know, assumed to be due to the pressures to remit money back home. And it was in 2008, in another qualitative study, that was the first study to bring up this pressure on the senders. And, you know, 10 years later, it's you know, fully tested. And so there was a lot of, you know, good stuff kind of to be gleaned from that study. And I think it particularly stands out to me because the intervention was simply training both the migrants and their families on bKash and how to use it, which was, I think, equated to about $12 per head to get those particular effects. I'm sorry, I've kind of messed up my thing here, but the next point was on insurance. So I don't even have a graph for that, because while we know that there are so many digital insurance products out there, and Senfree is doing great work in tracking them on their InsurTech tracker, which you should check out if you haven't seen it yet. But we've only located one study on insurance, and that's looking at the levers to increase adoption. And that study is from 2013, actually. And so far to date, we don't have any evidence on the medium or longer term effects of digital insurance. And it's the most glaring evidence gap that we have. So I hope this little mini overview of the EGM and the selection of insights has certainly kind of shown you what or how the EGM could be used. But I also think we need to think about how we can all continue to use the existing evidence and to build the evidence landscape. So earlier I spoke about the complex landscape of digital finance, and that we must be aware that it's not one thing. The design and delivery features vary, markets vary, and clients vary. And I wasn't intended to overwhelm everybody with all these nuances, but to make us more aware and more careful when we speak about impact. The main message really here is that while the landscape is complex, the studies themselves don't have to be. So there's more than one way to gather impact insights. And if we're going to be inclusive, then we need to make sure that we're expanding the conversation to include, in an appropriate way, voices and signal beyond those that are gatherable by experimental methods. You know, qualitative methods may not close the book on a topic, but they're excellent for beginning inquiries and inviting others to follow with more intensive designs. You know, there's a whole range of approaches that have been used to understand the impact of digital finance. As you can see in the EGM itself, there's various methodologies. And it's something that at FIDA, we've also kind of dedicated some time to thinking about, and wrote a paper on the approaches that have been used and can be used to determine the impact of digital finance programs in particular. And I think what this really all boils down to is that we absolutely need more involvement from the broader community in terms of contributing insights, you know, big or small, so that we can have an active conversation about impact. So, you know, every study that targets a gap, be it on a product, a market, a design and delivery mechanism, or a client segment, really helps bring us closer to an understanding of the various effects of various digital finance products. So really, you know, developing an evidence base is like building a puzzle, right? Each individual piece doesn't make the picture, but, you know, bit by bit, the picture will emerge. That's it. So that's me. Just please feel free to post any questions. I'm just having a quick check in to see if there is any. Oh, yeah. We're all shy. It was crystal clear. Okay. Just have a question from Ian on, have we applied any quality assessments of the studies that we've included in the evidence gap map? I mean, we have our methodology, we have that available on our website. And really what we looked at is, you know, a couple of inclusion criterias, and, you know, the main kind of being that, you know, it's on a particular digital finance product, and that product being tested is the main focus of the study, that the study is looking at particular client outcomes, and the service is clearly a digital finance service. And in terms of, we've kind of included grey literature, if you will, so studies that are beyond experimental methods, and we haven't, you know, applied strict rules in terms of, you know, sample sizes and things like this, but rather we've kind of taken things that, you know, are kind of clearly adding to the knowledge, and highlighted by their design and, or sorry, not their, by their methodology, so A to B tests and so on, and included them in there. And we've added the new filter on the different kind of variations of methodologies, because, you know, we are aware that some people only like to take their evidence from certain methodologies, and added that in. But what we have done is that we are kind of viewing this as a pretty inclusive range of the evidence that we have. Now, that's not to say that we include any studies that, you know, tested a product, it was their own product, and they asked 5 people about their product and everyone said they loved it, and that kind of stuff obviously kind of doesn't get included at all. It has to kind of pass the kind of like basic test in terms of, you know, there's a decent kind of sample size on it, and these are kind of clear kind of insights, particularly in a world of sparse evidence. Sorry, and sorry, just checking another one. Jessica Osborne, right hand. Yes. What's the most surprising thing that you found? Yeah, I think, you know, this is kind of the second year of this, and, you know, it will continue year on year. And I think the most surprising thing that I found is that we didn't find very much. You know, when we started this 2 years ago, like most people, we certainly hear the chatter around digital finance and all the effects that it could have. So I guess that when we got down to it, it was really surprising to find that most of this was untested theory. And there's a lot of papers and case studies using the word impact, but more so in anticipation. You know, this could have this effect, this could have X and Y effect, but there was kind of very limited impact or being studied. And so that was the main finding, and particularly around insurance as well, and credit. I'm quite surprised, considering the diversity of products, that there is so little. The second thing I found was, in particular this year, in kind of adding a few more studies, but also kind of doing a different analysis by looking at all the different, like all products in particular, and looking at all the studies on that particular product. I really believe that we get a lot of value out of looking at a particular study on products side by side. So when I was writing up the analysis for, you know, credit and savings, and just putting all these design and delivery mechanisms together, it kind of really started kind of pointing out how training really seems to be kind of boosting at least the immediate outcomes in terms of savings behavior and borrowing and repayment behavior. You know, and that's not something you'll kind of get across if you read kind of one study at a time, but rather if you put them all together. And so that's what I found particularly striking. Sorry, another chat. What is it about digital finance that seemed to lack impact studies? I come from a social science research background, and it surprised me when I moved into DFS. There seems to be less focus on impact and evidence-based research. You know, that's really interesting. And I think it's something we spoke about or wrote about in our approaches paper. I think, you know, digital finance, it's tricky because you're working, hopefully, with practitioners who, you know, need to make a profit from their business. And so, you know, doing studies where, you know, you might have to use a control group, for example, that doesn't usually fly very well if they're going to withhold their product from a particular market segment. It's not usually feasible, and, you know, competition could move in. So it's not often very ripe. And another factor with digital finance, if you're working with the practitioners, is that they're constantly innovating. They're moving, they're changing, they're building the plane in the air. You know, something is launched and then it's changed. Again, kind of a constantly changing or a moving target is not very inclusive for doing experimental research as well. And, you know, the other point is that if there are, you know, not so rosy findings, you know, a person in business is not going to be incentivized, and there's very limited incentives for them to want to publish something that says it may have, you know, no effect on somebody's welfare, or, you know, a negative effect. So I feel like the incentives are, you know, a little bit more difficult. Where we see a lot more of the studies, and I think this is true for payments and transfers, because a lot of these products are kind of market wide, and particularly in Kenya, Uganda, And Tanzania, we see a lot of studies on payment and transfers or mobile money generally, because most people have them and people can optimize using existing panel surveys, or just do or create their own panel surveys to be able to access that information and kind of bypass the providers as well. So yeah, those are initial thoughts on why that's doing. When you're using the word impact, are you referring to any effect along a results chain, or are you referring more specifically to the end results after outputs and outcomes released? Yes, so I know I've worked in M&E for a decade, and we all use these words quite interchangeably. Essentially, we're looking at from the point of adoption. So we were humming and hawing about including adoption, and I'm just going to bring up the evidence gap map itself. So we were humming and hawing about including the word adoption in the evidence gap map, but we thought that there's some particularly very interesting levers that are being pulled in terms to increase the adoption of certain services. And we thought that really had value, you know, in the evidence gap map, and particular value to digital finance practitioners if they're looking to kind of boost the adoption of certain products. For example, like in the early days or the earlier years, we saw a lot of people using agents with roving point of service machines or ATM cards, and looking at these different layering of technologies to boost the adoption of the products. So that's our first point of call. And then from that, because we're looking at digital finance as the big category, we spent a lot of time looking at the client theory of change, and we spent, you know, most of 2016, or at least the second half of 2016, dedicated to kind of reading the literature and understanding what is the, you know, tested and untested theory when it comes to change. And so when I talk about impact, I'm looking at, you know, like from the adoption after access, essentially. So after a client has access and is using a product, what can happen? And, you know, this is anything from their savings behavior, if it's a savings product, their borrowing behavior, if they're paying less in terms of time and money for financial services, whether they're empowered through greater privacy monitoring and control, if they smooth consumption, if they're better prepared to deal with shocks, improving their physical, educational, and emotional welfare, investing in income generating pursuits and asset building, and improving their income as well. So, and there's a lot of indicators under each of these, as you can imagine, which we've all highlighted in our EGM methodology paper. But what I would say as well is that, you know, if we locate a particular impact study that, you know, has stated something that isn't covered here, we will absolutely include it. So I could refer you to the methodology for a kind of a full, absolute kind of microscope breakdown of what can be included under each of these points. Another question as well. You mentioned that you will unpack some of the results and will publish a mini series on different topics such as digitalization. Can you please tell us all the topics in this series? Yes, we can. So we're starting with, we've obviously done the launch blog where we've kind of given the headlines that I've shared with you today. But we're also looking at producing a mini series starting next week, with the first one on digital savings. So all the kind of insights we've gleaned from putting all these studies together. The second one, about 2 weeks later, will be on credit. Third is payments and transfers. Fourth is looking in particular at product design and delivery mechanisms. So looking at all the different ways in which various products have been designed and delivered and what the implications of those are so far. And finally, a last blog on where we have been looking for impact So that's a nod to both, who are we looking at? Are they, just general populations? Are they smallholder farmers? Are they women? Are they entrepreneurs? And where we have the geography of our search. So really drilling down into that piece as well. Just wait a moment for any others, and then I will. Perfect. And I also want to kind of point out that I think this is a really great month for evidence. The MasterCard Saving Labs, our kind of sister learning partner, have also produced their savings evidence gap map, which you can see. And they are also having a webinar at the end of this month on October 30th called Navigating the Evidence on Savings-Focused Financial Inclusion. So if you really want to go deep into that, please go see that. And we will send out an email with this information, any of the information I've kind of referenced so far today, and a recording of the webinar as well. And I think my colleague might send out a quick 2-minute survey as well in the chat. But otherwise, we will also share that on the email. So I'd be very grateful if you could take a moment to do that. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks so much. It was really, really fascinating as a researcher myself, and just looking at the work that you guys have been doing. And I really look forward to seeing it growing, especially working in the sector. I really feel that need for evidence is something crucial, and I can't wait to see more and more work done and evidence being put out and distributed to the community at large. Again, please fill out the survey if you can right now, otherwise it will be emailed to you once the recording is uploaded. You'll be able to get a recording and be able to see this again. Please share it with your colleagues or anybody that you feel would be interested in it. And again, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned for any more webinars that we may do in the coming months. And other than that, I hope you guys have a fantastic Thursday. And yeah, thank you to the team at FIDA and to Neve and Abby for helping prepare and sort this webinar out.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.